The war everyone remembers as beginning in 1939 was already alive, breathing quietly in the ruins of 1918. Because when the cannons finally fell silent at the end of the First World War, peace was not truly built. It was imposed, fragile, resentful, and dangerously unfinished. And in that silence, the future conflict began to take shape, not through gunfire, but through humiliation, fear, and broken promises. Germany did not emerge from the Great War feeling defeated in spirit. It emerged stunned, starving, and furious, watching an empire collapse overnight while its soldiers marched home believing they had not been beaten on the battlefield, but abandoned by politicians who signed an armistice they did not understand or accept. And from this shock grew the stab-in-the-back myth, a lie that spread like a disease through veterans, newspapers, and political movements, claiming Germany had been betrayed by civilians, socialists, and Jews, poisoning the nation's understanding of reality before the ink on the peace treaty had even dried. The Treaty of Versailles, drafted with the stated goal of preventing another war, instead became a blueprint for resentment, stripping Germany of 13% of its territory, all its overseas colonies, most of its military capability, and forcing it to accept full responsibility for the war, while demanding reparations so massive they crushed any hope of economic recovery, all while redrawing the map of Europe in ways that satisfied strategic convenience rather than ethnic reality, creating new nations like Poland and Czechoslovakia that left millions of Germans suddenly living outside the borders of the state they still considered home. This was not merely a political defeat, it was a psychological one, because the treaty did not reconcile Germany to peace. It reminded Germans daily that they were being punished, monitored, and distrusted, and it ensured that democracy, newly born in the form of the Weimar Republic, would be blamed for every hardship that followed. Across Europe, the war had shattered old empires and replaced them with uncertainty. As Austria-Hungary vanished, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Russia descended into revolution and civil war, and millions of displaced people struggled to survive in a continent exhausted by violence, hunger, and grief. The League of Nations was supposed to safeguard this fragile peace, yet from its very first breath it was crippled, because the United States, whose power and idealism had shaped the vision, refused to join, leaving the League without the authority, unity, or military force needed to enforce its decisions, turning international law into little more than hopeful language. In Germany, the early years of the Weimar Republic were defined not by stability, but by chaos, with extremist groups battling in the streets, attempted coups from both the left and the right, political assassinations becoming routine, and the sense that democracy itself was weak, temporary, and unable to protect the nation from collapse. That belief hardened in 1923, when hyperinflation destroyed the German economy with terrifying speed, turning savings into worthless paper, forcing families to carry money in wheelbarrows to buy bread, and wiping out the middle class that democracy depended on for support, while foreign troops occupied the Ruhr to enforce reparations, deepening the sense of national humiliation and helpless rage. It was in this atmosphere that Adolf Hitler emerged, not yet as a world figure, but as a voice that transformed collective anger into a single narrative, blaming Germany's suffering on internal enemies and external conspiracies, promising strength, unity, and revenge, and presenting violence not as tragedy, but as destiny. His failed coup in Munich in 1923 should have ended his political career, yet his trial gave him a national platform, and prison gave him time to refine an ideology that fused racial hatred, authoritarian power, and territorial expansion into a vision that would later consume Europe. Though Germany briefly stabilized in the mid-1920s with foreign loans and diplomatic reintegration, the peace rested on borrowed money and borrowed time, And when the global economy collapsed in 1929, Germany fell faster and harder than almost any other nation, with unemployment exploding, businesses collapsing, and faith in democratic solutions evaporating as millions searched desperately for certainty and direction. In that desperation, extremist movements thrived, and none was more effective than the Nazi Party, which promised not compromise, but clarity, not debate, but action, and by exploiting fear, resentment, and nationalist pride, transformed itself from a fringe movement into the dominant force in German politics. By 1933, Hitler did not seize power through revolution. He was handed it legally by elites who believed they could control him, a miscalculation that would prove catastrophic, because once in office, he dismantled democracy with ruthless efficiency, silencing opposition, controlling the press, reshaping the state into a tool of ideology, and preparing the nation psychologically and materially for conflict, all while presenting himself to the outside world as a statesman seeking fairness rather than conquest. At the same time, the international system continued to erode, not because leaders did not see the danger, but because they were paralyzed by memory, haunted by the slaughter of the First World War, unwilling to risk another catastrophe, even as the conditions for one returned. Britain and France, burdened by debt, political division, and a generation scarred by trench warfare, chose appeasement not out of ignorance, but out of desperation, hoping that satisfying limited demands might preserve peace. Yet each concession only confirmed to aggressors that force achieved results. This pattern was not confined to Europe, because in Asia, Japan pursued its own path of expansion, driven by industrial hunger and nationalist ambition, seizing Manchuria in 1931 and withdrawing from the League of Nations when condemned, proving that international law had no enforcement mechanism, and showing Germany, Italy, and others that the global order would not stop those willing to defy it. As the 1930s progressed, the world drifted steadily towards conflict, not through one decisive moment, but through accumulated failures, each one making the next inevitable, until the question was no longer whether war would come, but when and where it would begin.
As Germany transformed internally, the illusion of peace across the world continued to crack, because the 1930s were not a calm before the storm. They were the storm, moving slowly, disguising itself as diplomacy while gathering force. Adolf Hitler's early moves were calculated tests rather than reckless gambles, designed to probe the will of the international community. And each time the response confirmed what he suspected, that the democracies feared war more than they feared him. When Germany reintroduced conscription and openly rebuilt its military in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, protests were filed and speeches were delivered, but nothing else happened. And when German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland in 1936, an act that could have been stopped with minimal force, French leaders hesitated and British leaders rationalized, convincing themselves that Germany was only reclaiming its own territory, while Hitler later admitted that had the French advanced, his forces would have been forced to retreat, a revelation that exposed how close the world came to stopping the war before it truly began. Instead, the moment passed, and with it passed the last realistic chance to halt German rearmament without catastrophic conflict. This emboldening effect rippled outward because the failure to act sent a message not just to Berlin, but to Rome and Tokyo as well, confirming that aggression, when cloaked in nationalist rhetoric, would be tolerated. In Italy, Benito Mussolini sought to revive the glory of the Roman Empire, and in 1935, he invaded Ethiopia, one of the few remaining independent African states, using modern weaponry against an underprepared opponent, even deploying chemical weapons in defiance of international law, while the League of Nations responded with weak sanctions that deliberately avoided oil, revealing that moral outrage stopped where economic interests began. The invasion succeeded, and the lesson was unmistakable. Conquest was possible without consequence. Meanwhile, in Asia,
Japan expanded its brutal war in China, committing atrocities on a massive scale, including the massacre at Nanjing. Yet the response from Western powers remained limited to condemnation because isolationism dominated American politics and Europe was consumed by its own instability. These parallel failures mattered because they normalized violence as a tool of policy, transforming the international system from one governed by law into one ruled by calculation. The Spanish Civil War then became the most revealing preview of what was to come, as Spain descended into a brutal ideological conflict that drew in foreign powers under the guise of neutrality, with Germany and Italy supporting the nationalists and the Soviet Union backing the Republicans, while Britain and France chose non-intervention, a decision that in practice favored the aggressors. For Hitler, Spain was invaluable, offering a real battlefield to test new weapons, tactics, and air power, culminating in the bombing of Guernica, which shocked the world but failed to provoke decisive action, reinforcing the belief that civilian suffering would not alter political will. By the late 1930s, the balance of power had shifted dramatically, yet policy lagged behind reality as Britain and France continued to believe that Hitler could be managed, negotiated with, or satisfied, even as his ambitions grew clearer with each move. The Anschluss of Austria in 1938 was greeted with enthusiasm by many Austrians and indifference by foreign governments, despite being a direct violation of international agreements, because it was framed as self-determination rather than conquest, demonstrating how language could be weaponized to disguise aggression. The crisis over Czechoslovakia later that year exposed the full fragility of European security because the Sudetenland was not merely a disputed region, it was the backbone of Czechoslovakia's defenses, and handing it over meant stripping the country of its ability to resist invasion. At Munich, Britain and France chose peace at almost any price, pressuring Czechoslovakia to accept the loss of its territory in exchange for Hitler's promise of no further demands, a promise celebrated at the time as a triumph of diplomacy. Yet in reality, it was a surrender that confirmed the collapse of collective security. For the people of Czechoslovakia, the agreement was a betrayal, and for Hitler, it was proof that the Western powers would sacrifice allies rather than fight. When German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, the pretense that Hitler sought only to unite German-speaking peoples collapsed completely, revealing an agenda of domination rather than revision, and finally forcing Britain and France to confront the reality they had long avoided. Guarantees were issued to Poland, signaling that further expansion would be resisted, but this shift came after years of retreat, and Hitler doubted their resolve, believing that past behavior would predict future action. At the same time, the Soviet Union watched these developments with growing suspicion, having been excluded from key negotiations and wary of Western intentions, and as ideological enemies circled one another, pragmatic calculations began to override moral positions. Stalin feared isolation and sought time to prepare for an inevitable conflict, while Hitler needed to avoid a two-front war. And from these mutual suspicions emerged one of the most cynical agreements in modern history, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that publicly promised peace while secretly dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. This agreement did not cause the war on its own, but it removed the final barrier to its outbreak, because it assured Hitler that he could strike Poland without immediate Soviet intervention, transforming long-standing tensions into imminent violence. By the summer of 1939, Europe stood on the edge not because leaders lacked information, but because they delayed action until options disappeared. And when Germany prepared to invade Poland, the path to war was already paved by 20 years of unresolved conflict, fear-driven decisions, and the repeated choice to postpone confrontation until confrontation became unavoidable.
As the summer of 1939 turned toward autumn, the illusion that war could still be avoided collapsed under the weight of accumulated mistrust, because every major power now understood that peace no longer depended on negotiation, but on preparation for violence. Germany mobilized with confidence, born not only of military strength, but of psychological advantage, having learned through years of appeasement that boldness produced results, while hesitation produced nothing. And Hitler framed the coming conflict not as aggression, but as correction, a necessary act to right the injustices imposed after 1918. Poland, reborn after more than a century of partition, stood defiant but vulnerable, its borders the product of post-war compromise rather than natural defense, its army brave but technologically inferior, and its leaders caught between two powers that both viewed its existence as temporary. Britain and France, having finally committed themselves to resistance, were nevertheless unprepared for immediate war, their armies in the midst of rearmament, their publics divided between fear and resolve, and their strategic thinking still shaped by the trauma of the previous conflict, assuming a long, static struggle rather than a rapid, mechanized assault. On September 1, 1939, when German forces crossed the Polish border under the pretext of fabricated provocations, the world watched not in shock, but in grim recognition, because the invasion did not feel like a surprise. It felt like the inevitable conclusion of a story that had been unfolding since the end of the last war. Blitzkrieg, a combination of speed, coordination, and overwhelming force, shattered Polish defenses in weeks, revealing how profoundly the nature of warfare had changed, while political thinking lagged behind. And when Britain and France declared war on Germany, their declarations carried moral weight but little immediate effect, marking the formal beginning of World War II, while leaving Poland to face destruction alone. Yet even this moment, often remembered as the clear dividing line between peace and war, was shaped by decisions made long before, because the invasion succeeded not only because of German strength, but because the international system had been hollowed out, alliances weakened, and trust destroyed over 2 decades of unresolved tension. The Soviet invasion of eastern Poland weeks later confirmed the brutal reality of great power politics, as Stalin moved to secure territory promised in secret agreements, demonstrating that ideology mattered less than opportunity when security was at stake, and signaling that the coming war would not be defined by moral clarity, but by shifting calculations. As Europe descended into conflict, the roots of the catastrophe became impossible to ignore, because the war was not the result of a single man's ambition or a single nation's aggression, but the culmination of systemic failure, where peace treaties punished without reconciling, international institutions lacked enforcement, economic collapse radicalized societies, and fear of war became so great that it made war unavoidable. The Great Depression did more than devastate economies. It shattered faith in liberal democracy, empowering authoritarian movements that promised order, certainty, and national revival. And in doing so, it reshaped global politics in ways that made compromise increasingly difficult. Across the world, the 1930s saw the normalization of violence as a political tool, as civil wars, invasions, and occupations occurred without decisive response, teaching aggressors that risk was manageable and resistance unlikely. This erosion of norms mattered deeply, because international order depends not on rules alone, but on the belief that those rules will be defended, and when that belief collapsed, power filled the vacuum. The tragedy of the interwar period lies not in ignorance, but in miscalculation, because leaders understood the dangers, yet repeatedly chose delay, hoping that time would solve problems that only grew worse with neglect. Each attempt to preserve peace by concession weakened the credibility of deterrence until deterrence disappeared entirely, leaving force as the only remaining language. The rise of totalitarian regimes further accelerated this process because their internal structures rewarded aggression, suppressed dissent, and framed compromise as weakness, creating political systems that required expansion to justify their authority. In Germany,
Propaganda transformed resentment into destiny, convincing millions that war was not only inevitable, but righteous, while dissenting voices were silenced or destroyed, ensuring that alternative paths were no longer visible. At the same time, the memory of World War I constrained democratic leaders, making them cautious to the point of paralysis, trapped between the responsibility to prevent war and the fear of repeating past mistakes, a tension that ultimately ensured they would face a worse conflict under less favorable conditions. By 1939, the international system had reached a breaking point because the balance between restraint and ambition had collapsed, and the mechanisms designed to manage conflict had failed at every critical test. War did not erupt suddenly. It emerged gradually through a series of choices that narrowed the range of possible outcomes until violence became the only remaining option. And when the first bombs fell and the first armies clashed, they were not starting a new story. They were concluding an old one, written in the years between the wars, shaped by human fear, pride, and the refusal to confront danger before it became uncontrollable.
In hindsight, the tragedy of 1918 to 1939 is not that humanity failed to imagine another war, but that it imagined peace without responsibility, believing that suffering alone would prevent repetition, when in reality, suffering without resolution only sharpens anger. The men who signed the armistice in 1918 believed they had ended the war to end all wars, yet they left unresolved the grievances, insecurities, and power imbalances that had caused it, and in doing so, they ensured that peace would be temporary. The Treaty of Versailles punished Germany without integrating it, isolated the Soviet Union without stabilizing Eastern Europe, and created borders that generated permanent tension, while the League of Nations embodied idealism without enforcement, a structure built on cooperation in a world drifting toward competition. Economic instability magnified every weakness, turning political debate into existential struggle. And when the Great Depression struck, it did not create extremism. It exposed how fragile the foundations of the post-war order truly were. Leaders across Europe and beyond faced impossible choices, constrained by domestic pressures, haunted by memories of mass death, and uncertain whether confrontation would save peace or destroy it. And many chose delay not because they were blind, but because the alternatives seemed worse. Yet each delay transferred initiative to those least interested in restraint. The dictators of the 1930s did not invent aggression. They exploited opportunity, learning from each crisis that resistance was unlikely, that moral condemnation carried no force, and that speed and confidence could reshape reality faster than diplomacy could respond. By the time democracies recognized the danger, they confronted not isolated aggressors, but a transformed world, where norms had eroded, alliances were fragile, and trust was absent, leaving rearmament and war as the only remaining tools. World War II was therefore not the product of madness erupting in 1939, but the final expression of a system that had failed repeatedly, a conflict made inevitable by unresolved peace, economic collapse, ideological extremism, and the gradual normalization of violence as policy. The lesson of this period is not that war is unavoidable, but that peace requires constant defense, moral clarity, and the willingness to confront danger early, because the cost of hesitation grows with every concession. When German troops crossed into Poland, the world did not suddenly lose control. It had been relinquishing control for 2 decades, step by step, agreement by agreement, until no peaceful options remained. The true beginning of World War II lies not in the roar of engines or the fall of bombs, but in the quiet decisions made after 1918, when the world chose punishment over reconciliation, hope over preparation, and delay over resolve, setting in motion a chain of events
that would consume a generation and reshape the modern world forever.